All right, troops, welcome. Matt Dixon, and this is the first of a series of meetings of Matt that we're going to be doing. In fact, this is a real resurgence of meetings of Matt over the coming weeks and months. We're going to get very, very regular with these sessions, and as we go into the new year, really have them as sort of formal parts of the global Purple Patch program again. When we think about that, the way that I want to structure these is hopefully get into a series of pretty short discussions, 20 to 30 minutes, and then leave a lot of scope to have some curated Q&A sessions. Tonight, it's a little different because we're talking about season planning, and this is a little meaty. This is only for Purple Patch athletes, and so what that enables us to do, we're not going to share this with the wider population. It's only going to be for athletes that are coached by us. And so what I want to do is let you peek behind the curtain tonight, give you a little bit of insight into some of the things that I'm planning to change and evolve, I think is the word, with coaching methodology, with what we're coming into next season. So what are the things that you're going to feel like is changing, and how, as we as coaches, do we think about structuring training plans for you guys as athletes? So we're going to talk about that, and then that is going to be the important context of planning your season, and try and hopefully give you a little bit of leeway or legway into understanding, okay, this is a great rhythm of a classic year. Because of the wide-reaching sort of global concept of the sport globally now, there are races that start in January and the last race of the year is in December. I have to anchor it around the North American season, where the bell, on the middle of the bell curve, are of our athletes. And so we'll do that, but it's pretty easy to get the concepts and shift and apply. So there's three things that we're going to go through today. The first is actually taking a break. We've had a lot of questions around taking a break, so I want to fly through that. I'd encourage you to listen to the last episode on the podcast on a season break, where I really sort of talk about it in depth. But let's go over and do a once-over lightly on that, because I think it's important in, okay, understanding a break is key, why, and how do we actually do it successfully. Then I actually want to go to the main body, break down some of the evolution in the way that we're going to evolve Purple Patch training for the upcoming season. And for you guys that have been here for a long time, there's going to be some important changes, all within the same methodology, but some important changes of how we apply it. And then finally, we get into planning your season. At the end of this, as we go through the session, feel free as we go through the discussion to pepper your questions. Kerry is reviewing them, so you can add them in the chat box, and I'll get to answer them at the end as we go through this. I'll probably be talking for at least 30 minutes, and then I'll go through and answer any questions that there are available to go through. So I really encourage you, don't wait till the end. Ask your questions as they come up. Just be aware as I'm giving the presentation that I can't actually see your questions. So one of the key questions here, oh dear, there it is. One of the key questions is, why do you need to take a break? And very quickly, for you guys, this is not for the broader education. This is for Purple Patch athletes. I think that there are a few key concepts that we should think about when you think about taking a break globally. The first is, look, mix it up. Whenever you are goal-driven, and this doesn't matter, by the way, whether you're thinking in an athletic lens or your passion is building toy trains or your passion is something to do with business, we simply cannot, emotionally or physically, keep the gas on full whack. We are cyclical. And in fact, even in a day of work, all the research proves is that focus is better in short sprints with little breaks between. If we bring that to a seasonal lens, both for many of the reasons that we think about below, it's fantastic to actually shift the emphasis and ensure that things don't become stale. And so the key thing of taking a little break between is to enable you to step away from the passion, from the goal-driven pursuit, so that ultimately we can create sustainability and consistency. Okay, super. The second component is what many of you guys are managing, which is your performance, your athletic performance within the context of a time-starved life. We are all, for the most part, very, very busy. And we have important pillars of our life. We have our athletic dreams, which of course we're here to try and help you pursue, but we also want to be healthy. We want to perform in the workplace. And of course, for our family and friends, we want to bring the best version of ourselves. And so within the context of their life, if these athletic goals are really important, a large body of the year, it requires you to put a lot of dedication and you might say a lot of sacrifice to your goal. If you're going to go and race your first Ironman or try and podium at the 70.3 World Championships, whatever the pursuit is, it requires not balance in your life, but some dedicated focus without the sacrifice of the structure of your life. And so a break is really important to give back a little bit, to actually provide context of why you're doing this and ensure that you can ultimately create sustainability. It's also critical for a mental refresh. As we talked about above, any project involves periods, it thrives if you enable yourself phases or periods of physical and emotional space. And so even if you're building your company and you're an entrepreneur that's really looking to drive and thrive, having the opportunity to step back, move away from the project, enables you to come back with fresh passion, new lens, new eyes, and new vigor. The same applies in athletics. We need to step away. And without that stepping away, there is only root. There is going to become a passion that's going to evolve into more like something you just do. And ultimately, that's going to decline performance. There, of course, as well, is the physical repair, hormonal and structural rejuvenation. We need that for our muscle tissue. We need that for our system. The body is a constant game of stress, training stress, and adaptation. We need to sometimes allow ultra adaptation, allow just a deeper cleaning. Almost think about it, you can tell I'm in the mood for metaphors tonight, as a deep spring cleaning of your house. And so this is a wonderful opportunity to get that in. And finally, we want to keep our passion alive, because it doesn't matter how dedicated you are, if that dedication is not driven by passion, and passion is enjoyment, and then the dedication will wane. And I put in one of my favorite quotes, which is, gluttony doesn't produce hunger. And if you're passionate and hungry for success, it's great. But if you never take a step back, and then you're going to become gluttonous, and ultimately you're going to become bored. And that's not the route to performance. And so taking a break at the big picture is really important. So great, you might say, I'm going to take a break, but what does that actually mean? And in the podcast, I said, don't be a sloth. And I think this is really important for you guys. When we're thinking about taking a break from structured training, that doesn't mean a 3-month sabbatical. In fact, it's critical for your pursuit long term that it isn't a 3-month sabbatical. At the same time, when you take a break, you don't need to turn your back on being the fundamental elements of being a healthy human being. And if we think about general population, you guys are not general population, you're performance-minded individuals. But we think about the average healthy human being, at least our lens of it, they exercise frequently, they eat mostly well, they try to get good sleep, and occasionally they have a little bit of excess. And I think that that is the lens to go into your break. It's 2 to 3 weeks in duration, and it's a wonderful opportunity to not train, but exercise. And that means that you should try different things. It's not just about swim, bike, and run less, or swim, bike, and run a little easier. It's go and try yoga. Go and do Barry's boot camp or Soul Cycle, something different. Go on hikes, get out your mountain bike, whatever it means. But you're no longer looking to improve through that training mindset. You're looking to exercise. And then you eat and sleep mostly well, so you don't turn your back on good habits. But it's great if you have a few late nights out with friends, if you enjoy some of the foods that maybe you've reduced in your regular diet because you were just getting ready for your first Ironman or your first half Ironman or your key race of the season, whatever it might be. So in that time of exercise, if you're giving yourself 2 to 3 weeks that you're shutting off emotionally and you're no longer training, you're just exercising, drop the metrics, drop the intervals, get naked, be free. Be free. There's no need to track or progress. You're not looking to improve. You're looking to heal, rejuvenate, and step away from your problem or your challenge, your passion, I should say. Not your problem, your passion. And so I think that's a really important thing. You don't have to swim with your Garmin on. You don't have to have a heart rate strap. You don't need to ride with your power meter. Leave them at home. And trust me, you'll be okay. Life will go on. In fact, you might even, woe betide, enjoy going out for a bike ride and stopping for a coffee if you have time. I think you have to, when you do this, it's a physiological fact, but you have to also at this time embrace it emotionally that you're going to lose form. So you're going to lose your global fitness a little bit because healing means detraining, and you're not going to be able to perform at the same levels or with the same outputs as you did when you were just at the height of building into your A races. And so that's great. And the mindset there is you need to think of yourself and embrace the military mindset. We're going to strip you down, then we're going to build you up. Apart from this, it's we're going to heal and repair, and then we're going to start the cycle again, and we're going to build you up. That building you up starts very patiently and incrementally, and what we'll talk about tonight, which is with postseason. Of course, over the course of these 2 or 3 weeks, it might be a busy time because I want you to fill your bucket of life. So family, friends, adventure, planning, thinking about what's important to you, and maybe even giving a little bit more to work. If this is a busy time, it's a wonderful opportunity. But this duration, this break, it's critical, but it's short. I would say no more than 2 to 3 weeks. I think it's actually at least 2 weeks, no more than 3 weeks. So you are literally turning your back on the sport. Over the course of the first week or 2 of that, you don't think about planning your triathlon. In the last week, you begin hatching your plan and you start looking forward globally. So I wanted to give you the once over lightly of that, of why is it important for me as I think about the athlete population and individual athletes, and then what does it look like? But here we come to the meat and potatoes. Now I'm going to try and go through this relatively succinctly. I'm taking what was a 2-hour discussion with our coaching team today, and I'm going to compress it down for you guys into about 15 minutes. But I've made it pretty simple. I would argue that most of you guys that are purple patch athletes are familiar with the overall phases of training. So you have probably heard me talk about postseason and preseason and race-specific training, the importance of taking a break, and then even potentially, some of you guys realize, a second phase of race-specific training. For next year, we're actually going to revise it. It's going to involve a little bit of a change in name, and we're actually going to take the methodology and what we're looking to accomplish, and we're going through this with our coaches at the moment, our team of coaches, the whole Purple Patch team. We're creating a really familiar and common language around our workout structure, how we think about structuring our weeks, and how we think about our season. And our mission, whether you're on whatever program you're on, whether you're coached individually by me or anyone else, we're looking to have that common language be a part of us as a coaching team and you guys as athletes. And so tonight is the first representation of that. I don't expect you to remember it all or start executing on it, but it's the first representation of it to help you. This chart is not to scale, but let me talk through, and we're going to talk in North American terms. Let me talk through the phases of training from how we emotionally start the year, and we start the year around November, globally, the athletic year, and it finishes around Hawaii, middle of October. And so you take your season break, and the next step, which is about now, while we're having this discussion, for the majority of the Purple Patch athletes, there's outliers on either side, Southern Hemisphere athletes, athletes that have still got late season Ironman or half Ironman races, but the majority of the athletes that we can throw the blanket in and over are entering into a critical phase that we call postseason. And postseason is a phase of preparation. We won't go too much into it on this chart, we will in a second. But postseason is a phase of preparation, and it's about, shorter this year, about 6 to 8 weeks in duration. Now, what's new for this year is we're going to have even more of an emphasis in postseason around the technical side of the sport. We are going to be even more patient in developing fitness. We want to really dive into the technical components of swimming, cycling, and running. We're going to be very, very patient in trying to build our platform of general fitness. But what we are going to do is we're going to work on a lot of speed and power, some stuff that is very, very far away from event-specific training that we'll be doing later in the year globally. So post-season will be familiar. It's 6 to 8 weeks in duration. The difference this year, it's going to have even more patience. It's going to be a little easier in training load, but we are going to really ask you to focus in on the technical aspects that we're going to go through, a conversation for the next meetings with Matt, some of the toys and tools and technical focus across the 3 sports that we're going to work on, and we're going to have some fun with some high-speed work. What's new this year is as we start to progress through to the end of postseason, we're going to introduce a new little mini block of work called the prep phase. And the prep phase is an emotional and physical transition from technical and speed to preparing your body for the very heavy work that's going to come up in the next phase of training. And so that's when we're going to start to introduce some stronger low cadence work on the bike. We're going to start to introduce some harder hill-based running. We're going to start to do the first snippets of things like threshold or maximal steady state and over distance swimming. So it's going to feel like for the first time for many of you guys towards the end of the calendar year that it's like, oh, they're starting to introduce a little bit of work to me. And we're going to divide those. And so it's just a little modular block. The reason for that, the reason that we're going to sort of take the back end of postseason and call it its own phase, and this is behind the curtain, is that as a coaching team, what we want to have is the ability to talk to you guys, the athletes, and say, here's a prep phase. And if for some reason something happens over the course of the next year, let's say that you get sick or you get very busy or you go away for 3 or 4 weeks with the family and your training program is really disrupted, whatever might happen, we hope it's not an injury, but if someone gets injured, this is the type of work that we could plug in and introduce at any time of the year. So it's familiar to you, but it can ramp you back into race-specific training or strength endurance type training. And so it's a nice modular, you're going to hear that word a lot, modular lens to approaching training globally. Now comes the big change, and it's really in naming, although the structure of how we're doing this. Typically then, for North American athletes, January, February, March, we go into a phase that we call pre-season. We're going to change that to really parallel what we're looking to do in the phase. So we're going to rename internally us Purple Patch athletes. We're not going to reprint the Fast Track Triathlete or anything, but we're going to rename that phase Build. It's going to be a build phase of work. And the reason for that is that what we're looking to do over the course of that block of work is we're looking to build resilience. We're looking to build our platform of fitness that we're going to live on for the rest of the year. And we're looking to build and develop the tools and awareness that we're going to apply in our race-specific year. So This is going to be the new pre-season. And the mission of this, the personality of this, is going to shift a little bit. In previous years, it has been solely about a concept that many of you guys know, strength endurance, hill-based running, low cadence work on the bike, and a lot of paddle work in swimming. That feature is going to remain because I would say that's the special sauce of what we're doing. But we want to help athletes join the dots more between the heavy strength endurance work, and let me give you an example, sitting at 45 RPMs on the bike at a hard effort. That's heavy strength endurance work, but that's not real world. So we want to inject within the rhythm of training a bit more type of riding at 60 to 65 RPM, strong efforts at race intensity that we introduce a little earlier in the year. And that's going to accomplish two things. The first is joining the dots between what you're doing with the strength endurance and making it apply to a real world situation that you're going to use in racing. The second thing is it's going to help you in your early season races to perform very well, something that historically we've done very well anyway. And the third reason is I think it will prevent an accumulation of too much fatigue. And as you know, it's very, very important that we get really fit, but we're still fresh in the back end of the year. And by hitting you on the hammer 2 weeks in a row of heavy strength work, we feel that by the end of 3 months, you're very fit, but you're a little fatigued. Again, blanket statement, not talking about individuals. And so we're going to have a little bit more variance. That will be fun for you guys because you'll have familiarity with variance. And so it's going to change a little bit. That block of work is going to typically go through 4 cycles of 3 weeks. And we're going to break down what each 3-week cycle looks like. So you guys are going to have to, or will get familiar with a 3-week cycle of work that will be applied 4 times. And that will make up the build phase of training. So again, it's pretty subtle, but it's important in mindset. Pre-season becomes build. We then go into something which is familiar, which is your race-specific phase. This is when you start to really drive towards your A race, your first A race or A races of the year. And that typically starts to convert as a middle of the bell curve, April, May to June timeframe, about 12 weeks. And this is where we're looking to now retain some of the strength endurance focus, but shift the overall personality to race specificity. Another phrase that you probably haven't heard me talk about, but you're going to hear me say about 8 times tonight, the way that we're structuring race specific this coming year is to maximize performance predictability. So we want you to become empowered to understand what works for you and start to create a rhythm of training that on every 3rd week, you are feeling good and executing a race simulator that feels like it's progressing throughout the year, and you can track your progress, which is a good thing, and you come a nail on the back. More on that in a second. So straight away, just a teaser for later, as you think about it structurally from a race race planning standpoint, the great time to inject races is the first thing. We want to divide the season in 2. You can probably afford to have an A race earlier in the year and an A race later in the year, but we want to make sure that structurally we're dividing it in 2. A great time to introduce your A race is somewhere, if you were just a North American athlete, somewhere in that May, June, July time where it's in race specific training. Doesn't mean you can't perform great earlier, but that's a great time to actually execute a great race. In the build phase of training, that's a wonderful time to introduce some early season racing and actually apply early season racing with B races, which doesn't mean B performance. It just means the lens that you're structuring your training around. I think equal to the end of the year then, we'll have as a group or an individual at a certain time, 1 to 2 weeks in the middle of the year to cleanse. And then we will recycle the same personality with 2 shorter blocks of work. a shorter build focus and a second ramp of race-specific training that goes into your key later season events. And so the main body of fitness and resilience is built early in the season, once we come off postseason, and the second half of the year, as you come into many of you guys racing at, let's say, 70.3 Worlds, Ironman Hawaii, Ironman Maryland, Indian Wells in December, whatever your late season races are, great time to have a second build, shorter in personality. So it's evolved, it's not radically different, but it's evolved in mindset. So what does that mean? Well, let's go through and let's talk about some of the things to expect over the course of the postseason work. So now we're talking about that first block of work postseason, 6 weeks with a prep following for most of you guys. What you're going to see this year is more trackable progression. And what I mean by that is repeating and evolving main sets. So if we start in early November and we have a session that is on November 5th, you're going to see that same session about 3 weeks later. First week, second week, third week, and then that fourth week, you'll see the same session again, but it will be evolved. So it will grow a little bit. It will be a bit more challenging. You'll do another week, then that fourth week again, you'll see the same session again for the third time in the phase, in the 9th week, as it were, which now will be in prep phase, postseason, and it will be the same session and evolved again, and now it's strong. And that will go across key sessions, swim, bike, and run. So you're going to have a little bit of familiarity, and I think listening to you guys will appreciate this because it will help you more easily feel and see the progression that you make. Because by repeating it, but making sure it's not boring, you don't want to repeat it every week, but every third week you go, I did this before, it's just evolved, I get it, now I'm going to move on. We're also going to inject around the main set, knowing that a workout is warm-up, pre-main set, and main set. That main set will evolve, but in the entire postseason, we're going to have very familiar warm-up and pre-main sets. What I mean by that is every single swim session in post-season, so by phase, over the course of the 6 weeks, every single swim session is going to have one of 4 to 5 warm-ups. So 10-minute easy, 600, 400, 200. So single sessions that you will see over the course of your 2, 3, 4, 5 swims that you might do a week, where you're always seeing a warm-up that you can move into autopilot and can become familiar with what works for you. Equal to that, every swim session in post-season, so by phase, will have one of 5 or 6 pre-main sets. And those pre-main sets will be in purpose either primers, getting the engine ready for hard work, or technical. And what that enables you to do is, I think as a squad, as a group, as a team, what enables us to do is to not be blinded by the information on the complexity of the swims or the bikes or runs. You go, that's the warm-up, I've done it. Maybe once a week that you'll hit the same warm-up. It will never be more than once a week. But I know that warm-up, I can go and do it. Pre-main set, once you've done it once, it's super familiar. You're doing that type of pre-main set somewhere between every 7 to 10 days. So never enough to get boring, but enough to be familiar that you can focus on the technical aspects and actually learn what starts to work from you. And then you have that main set that is repeated every 3 weeks or so. So we've got a bit more repeatability and familiarity without getting bored. In postseason, as I talked about as well, we're going to have a heavy focus on technique. And what that means is I'm burdened, and my team is burdened with producing more technical videos for you. So in the swims, in the runs, in the bikes, we're going to really try and give as many of a stream of media into your workouts as possible, so that when we introduce some more technical concepts, you know what we want you to do. And I think that that will be really helpful. And then finally, a lower total load on physical stress, less hours for many of you, but more speed. So the real reason or the real mission of this phase of training for us is to stay emotionally fresh, have a chance to really evolve technically, but leave space to grow. And that means that if you regularly train 12 hours a week, I only want you to train 7 or 8 hours a week at most in postseason. If you're 20 hours a week, you're probably doing 12 to 15 hours a week. Space to grow physically and practically and enable us to fill up the other bucket of life. We then have that prep phase, if you remember that 3-week modular phase. So this is basically a transition in mindset, physically and practically, to our first heavy work of the season. So this is really a gentle reminder of upcoming health. It's going to be very strong, very hard work in the preseason, or what we are now calling build phase of work. And this is a cue you'll actually be told. This is prep work for you, whether you're individually coached or part of the wider organization. And this is a shifting mindset from prep phase of training to training. Okay, this is the first chance. And it's going to start to strengthen the tendons, muscles, and ligaments and get you prepared for then when we can hit the build phase, you're ready to absorb, remain healthy, and maximize the adaptations from that hellish hard work that is coming. We're going to break that up into the first modular breakdown point, which I'll show you in a second. 3 weeks of cycle. And this is going to have a very familiar rhythm of training as we're going to go out for the rest of the training year. So the mission of the prep phase is the first pressure on the system and legs. So I hope that makes sense conceptually. It really enables you to say postseason, technical, give myself space, prep. Okay, I need to start to shift the mindset. It's going to be around the holidays. I might be traveling, but I'm ready for working for most of you guys January. And then bada bing, we come on to this, the build phase of training. So what are we looking for? Well, we know the meat and potatoes of Purple Patch, a whole bunch of strength, endurance, and resilience. That is always will be, I might hasten to add, the backbone of our build phase or old preseason phase of training. So a lot of low cadence work, hill-based running, and this year even more components of strength-based swimming. We'll get to that in the next discussion we have around toys and tools. We're going to start to inject real-world training, and as I mentioned earlier in the year. So we're going to get you used to pacing and get you familiar with actually having an awareness of pacing, and it should be really, really smooth. We're going to ingrain performance predictability for you. And so we're really going to look to actually start to dial in and nail down the rhythm of race week so that by the time you're actually racing, you're really familiar with what works for you. And we're going to build that in every third week all the way through this sort of modular mindset. And ultimately, we're going to look to start to maximize the specific and needed training that you can do within a healthy lens. And so we're going to start to have careful application of more running miles. But we want to do it without causing injury. We want to start to develop your resilience and endurance platform on the bike without you being gone from your family and friends every single Saturday for 6 hours at a time. And so we're starting to build resilience, develop consistency with a heightened sense of specificity. At the same time, we want you to stay vibrant. And that's why the mission is consistency and specificity, which creates vibrancy. And so what does that look like? Well, this is something that is the first wash. But when I talked about postseason, I said repeating main sets that are coming every 4th week. So week 1, week 2, week 3, it comes to life in the build phase. And what I mean by that is each 3 weeks of training is going to be built as a 3-week cycle. And so our coaches and you guys are going to start to develop a shared language of, okay, how do I emotionally break down a 3-week cycle of work? So there's going to be a work week, a first work week. There's going to be a second work week. And then there's going to be, familiar language to many of you, a transition week. So work week 1, work week 2, and a transition week. And the reason we're calling it that, work week 1, work week 2, transition week, rinse and repeat, work week 1, work week 2, and a transition week. So let's actually start at the bottom. What the transition week is a shift in mindset, which is a chance for recuperation. So enable us to absorb the work that we've done in the first 2 weeks ahead, and prime us where we want you, life outside, we want you to feel good on the weekend of a transition week. Because the rhythm and the pattern of training should start to match a typical rhythm and pattern of what you will utilize in a race week. So a transition week is really a race prep week, but just a little bit more work, a little bit more training, because we don't have to rest like it's an entire rest week or race week as we're going through. So in that week, you're not going to have too much strength endurance. It's not going to be heavy hill-based running. It's a chance to rejuvenate, but we keep that race rhythm mindset so that on the weekend you can do a hard workout that is repeatable at the end of each cycle, and you can start to learn what works for you, and the coach can start to learn what works for you. And as you progress through, then you hit the weekend and you are, by definition, race ready. Of course, in the early part of the season, as we're in this phase, that's a wonderful week to have a race. And in fact, we're not stuck on this 3-week cycle, but if we have a race, let's call it an early season race, and you're going to Puerto Rico, your coach, or we, would apply a transition week and then give you a bit of rest and recuperation. Then you would re-enter a 3-week module. So that's a transition week. It's on a regular week cycle of training. We want athletes to repair, rejuvenate, and increase performance predictability. If they're racing, that's the type of week that we would put going into a race. Very similar in rhythm and pattern. So how about the work? How about the actual training? How do we go about the training as we hit it? Well, the first week, and I should say this up front, I'm talking in general patterns here. So it's a overall methodology of which we have to, of course, filter and apply to individuals. But as a general rule, the first week of a cycle in a build phase is strength endurance focus. You guys that are returning after last year, very familiar. It is heavy strength-based riding and running. And so that is where the key swim sessions are going to be power and strength-based. This is where you can expect a very heavy dose of strength and low cadence work for the more accomplished athletes sitting at 40, 45, 50 RPM at a hard effort. And it's also the week that we're going to look to build the biggest running accumulation of work. And for many people, that might mean running on a Friday and on a Saturday and on a Sunday and accumulating the running resilience and miles that so many of you guys are begging for. Week 1, the hardest week of training, the one that is the most stressful. Week 2, different to this year, we keep the strength component, but we convert it less to the depths of strength endurance, and instead we name it strength pacing. And what we mean by that is some extended time trial type work where you're doing strength-based riding, but it's more a real-world application. So this might be strong efforts of 10 minutes, but more at 65 RPM versus 5 minutes at hard efforts at 45 RPM from the week before. So it starts to bridge. It's still strength endurance, but it gets you there. We're also going to have you doing some time trial position inside or outside at your race pace. So you can expect a weekend ride that we might ask you to go 3 or 4 or 5 or even 6 by 10 minutes at a half Ironman effort at 65 RPM, but you're doing it in your time trial bars. And so it's a bridge. It's going to be a different personality. So it's a strength endurance week still, because we're in the build phase, but it has a race-specific theme. And then the overall bubbling is this would be the weekend that likely we would have a bit more of a riding emphasis. And so what that enables us to do from a life structural standpoint is look at our calendars and say, hey, 1 week out of every 3, I might even do a double ride weekend for some of you guys. But the other weekends, time commitment is going to be a little bit less, and I have the opportunity to go and run and spend more time with my family and friends. So it fits both within a training cycle, but also within life. Now, for our pro athletes, we don't really care if they have a life. It's the same intention, but we just have big miles and the whole weekend dominated by the big riding miles on that second week. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of a concept of what the build phase looks like. Once you get to the end of that build phase, you are very strong, very resilient and fit, and I would expect many of you guys to be racing once or twice in that time. But our lens and our structural planning is more around a B race mindset. That does not mean B performance. In fact, many of your guys' performances might be the best performances of the year in that phase. It sometimes happens, and it might be a breakthrough performance, but it's more B, the way that we structure planning. So that's important. It's not B performance, it's B from a planning standpoint. Once we go through those early season races, if you are going to choose to do some early season races for North American athletes, that might be, as I mentioned, Puerto Rico in March, or Oceanside 70.3 at the start of April, Galveston, Texas 70.3 early April, races like that. So key races, important races, but not what we're basing our training on. Once we go through that phase, and it's typically for most athletes about 4 cycles, 12 weeks, a different set of warm-ups and pre-main sets, a different repeating and evolving and progressing cycle of workouts every 3 weeks to increase or maintain that familiarity. We then go into race phase of training. So this is where we are looking to get race ready. So this is where we're looking to actually say, convert some of that strength, endurance, and resilience and the race pacing to real-world application to have you flying. So in this phase, we feel like we did this year to great effect, retain the strength endurance component, because we never want to lose that familiarity as a tool to use outside, and the resilience that comes with it. It will retain the rhythm, that 3-week modular mindset of training, the rhythm of the build phase. And so it's going to help you with familiarity of, I'm used to this cycle of training now, and it's going to be much easier for us collectively to track your progress. It's an easy block to integrate B races, continued, and at the end of this phase should be your 1 or 2 A races. Some of you guys go back to back, the Dirty Dixon double. So that's at the end of this phase. The way that we've built this is to really try and prevent fatigue and resource flattening. Mental fatigue, physical resource. We don't want you to get stale emotionally or physically. And so what we've tried to inject is a lot of variability in a predictable fashion. That sounds paradoxical, but variability that's predictable. And that's really good for the body and the mind. So our goal is to maximize the resources that we've built in the build phase and evolve to race readiness. And so what happens is a very familiar chart, but it's actually different when you look deeper. You still have work week 1, work week 2, and a transition week. But now week 1 isn't that 45 RPM, it's strength endurance, and it's focused intervals, continuing on the path to evolve our physiology, our fitness. But the strength endurance becomes real world, somewhere between 60 and 75 cadence. We have a lot of pace pyramids, so some real aspirational race pace brick runs that are coming off the bike. And this is the week that you can expect some above race intensity hard efforts. So this is your high speed swimming, your 6 by 4 minutes, very, very hard strength endurance, but real world strength endurance biking. So it's focused intervals. The second week then, we apply careful race simulations. So a high stimulus with now that race-ready mindset. So we start to look for outside riding that involves terrain management. We have a lot of cadence, so we're doing a lot of time trials at or above race pace with integrating the tools. So you might be asked to do 20-minute pieces of work that are hard, but you're doing at 75 RPM, 90 RPM, 70 RPM, 90 RPM to get you with that familiarity of what happens on your race. And we're going to have some very intentional race-specific intensity. Now, a word I say in the queue here, or above. And the reason for that is for time-starved athletes and the majority of amateur athletes, training just at Ironman intensity within the scope of a slightly more compressed training hours just isn't a big enough stimulus. And so we'll often ask you to run more at a half Ironman effort and then finish at Ironman effort to create the physiological stimulus needed to continue adaptations. But overall, a lot of work at race-specific intensity. 2 hard weeks of work, the first more focused intervals, the second, race simulations and getting you ready for the real-world demands. And then again, the transition week, very familiar to you. Recuperation, performance predictability, and very much in the same vein as what you'll be doing in the week of a race. And so that enables you then to cycle through 1, 2, 3, or 4 cycles and end with your A race. By the time you hit that, you have a great degree of rhythm in your training and performance predictability. I'm either completely confusing everyone or they're like, this is great. I guess we'll find out afterwards. So what does that mean from planning your season? I know quite a few of you guys are asking about that. So I think that number one, you have a couple of goal phases. So when we come back to our original roadmap, I had the season emotionally and practically broken into 2 parts, early season and then later part of the season. So I think when you think about your races, whatever your goal are, case study, and I'll show you a case study in a minute. You're getting ready for an Ironman, and I want to do 2 Ironman races. It's great not to bring them just a month apart, not to bring them 6 weeks apart for the most part. There is an outlier occasion that you can do that, but say, okay, if I'm a North American athlete, I'm going to look somewhere in the early to midsummer for my first race, and then I need to give myself a break and re-go through a mini cycle of build and race specific and come again and hit my late season A races. And that's the way that we want to actually build in an entire season, but with the opportunity to have 2 key mini seasons within that. We also need to remember that not every single race that you're going to do is an A race from a planning standpoint. I think the most number of A races an athlete can have is 2 to 3. From a structural standpoint, the professional athletes, because we get to compress their postseason a little bit, they can probably get 3 A races in for a year. But for most amateurs, it's 2 main A races. Now we may cluster them. So we might actually say, hey, we're looking for a great phase of the year that I want to be hitting, and I'm going to do some back-to-back half Ironman or Olympic distance races. They're going to be in late June or early July, and you go boom, boom, boom. These are the 3 races I'm going to do over 5 weeks, and I want to hit them all and hit them well, and there's a way to do that. But globally, we're really looking at 2 phases or events a year that you can have an A race. With that, it doesn't mean your B races are races that you are going to perform poorly at. And I mention that, but it's really important. Every race you do, you approach as an A race. You are open to a great performance. This is more about planning your season, structuring how you build and how we build your training to associate with those races. The best place for those B planned races, and here's a great time, here's a great thing to remember, because you're going to choose your A races first lightly. I'm going to go and do Ironman Lake Placid, and then I'm going to have Santa Cruz 70.3 in September to be my other A race of the year. Great. Here's a good planning tool for you. I think it's a great idea to have your B races 2 weeks before an A race, and I'll explain that in a bit. 4 weeks before isn't a bad rhythm, or 7 weeks or more. So 2 weeks, 4 weeks, 7 weeks. It's doable to have a race the week before, not really advised for most people. It's doable to have it 3 weeks before, but it's tougher to get the rhythm right 3 weeks before. It's easier, ironically, to get it ready 2 or 4 weeks before. And then 7, 8, 9, 10 weeks before, golden. Okay, before that, as many B races as you basically like within practically. I would encourage you, when you think about race planning, to cluster, but don't spread. So what I mean by that is, I think a bad way to plan your season is to say, you know what fits with life is I can race about once a month. So I'm going to race in early April, early May, early June, early July, early August, early September. The only one thing that's going to happen as a product of that is you're going to build fitness to early April, and then over the course of the rest of the season, your fitness is going to start to decline. And the reason for that is that for every single race that you do, that week is going to obviously be lighter and lighter than a transition week. And then it requires a certain amount of repair and rejuvenation afterwards. So the week following is a recovery and a building in week. So by racing once a month and having a consistent week after the race down, week before the race, you've only suddenly got one little cycle of work to get back up of quality training. So what you don't get is rhythm of training, starting to layer blocks of work between. So I would much rather you instead look at races and say, hey, I'm going to do a race a week apart or 2 weeks apart, or maybe 3 weeks apart in the early season, because it doesn't really matter on that rhythm side of stuff. But I need to, at some stage, get to put together 6, 7, 8, 9 weeks that I can clear the mind and I can train. And that's a really important. So when you look at your planning, when am I going to get my block of training? So if you look at your race plans and you've signed up for Oceanside and St. George at the start of May, and something in the start of June, Hawaii 70.3, and then Racine at the start or middle of July, and then Maine at the start of August, we might want to revisit that. Because I think it's really hard to take a step back and say, I need to get a body of work in. And it's actually way easier to do a little build into a race, let's say the start of May, and back-to-back week or 2 weeks apart, or even 3 weeks apart, go almost back-to-back, the Dirty Dixon double, cluster the races, then recover, and then put together a block of work. So it's not such a bad thing to say, I'm going to race in the middle of April, I'm going to race on May 5th, and then my next race is going to be July 10th, whatever it might be. But you're giving yourself then the rest of May and the rest of June to go and put together that race-specific training that you're going to want to go and do. For the very advanced athletes, in fact, not really even the very advanced, I take that back, but for the more experienced athletes, because advanced makes it sound like I'm talking about podium chasers. I'm talking about people with a little bit of experience of racing these types of things. When we think about an Ironman build, one more thing to think about might be around clustering your Ironman races. So what that means, and I'll give you a living example that we're going through right now. Athletes that finish the Hawaii Ironman and then 5 or 6 weeks later go and do Ironman Arizona. It's a wonderful double. But for those athletes, we're not training for the Hawaii Ironman and then training for Arizona. What we're doing is we're training for Ironman Hawaii, we're recovering from it, then we are living off of that training for Ironman Hawaii, and we're just doing a bunch of fast stuff, and we go and do the second Ironman off of the back of that first Ironman build. And so an Ironman race with enough time for recuperation and repair, but not so much time that you lose fitness, is wonderful. And that tends to be somewhere around 4 to 8 weeks. And so there is a scenario that you can spend, for you Ironman fanatics in the crowd, You can spend the whole front of your year on 70.3 in Olympic distance and short course racing. And then you might say, you know what, I'm going to go and do Wisconsin in September, and I'm going to go and do a late October or early November Ironman Florida. And that should double up. And while that might be emotionally challenging, practically challenging, from a physiological standpoint, it's actually not too stressful. And the key to this is people say, but how can you race 2 Ironman races back to back? That's obviously a big burden financially, I understand. It is a potential burden on the family. But from a physiological standpoint, the Ironman day is stressful. But what brings the great suppression is the overtraining of people going into the race. So you will bounce back quicker from an Ironman if you're going into it fit and fresh than if you go into it over accumulated with fatigue, which is what we talk about tonight is what we're trying to avoid. So what does that look like? This is a classic season. We think about post-season, we think about the prep phase, we think about build. So we go through, and this on the screen, I did this, I started to draw charts, and I thought this is going to take me entirely too long. So you've got a build phase of training. Within that build phase of training, we might inject a couple of races, one back to back, yeah, about a month apart, but it's okay to do it once. Oceanside or Texas 70.3, just by way of a random example. And a month later, you might go and do Wildflower or St. George. So a couple of races back to back. But then this athlete is going to do 7 or 8 weeks later, is going to go and do an Ironman or an Ironman 70.3A race. So what they would look for there is that magic 7 or 8 week block of training to get them ready. They're then having a block or a break, and then they rebuild with not 12 weeks of a progressive build, but 4, 5, 6, or 7 weeks. And then they go through and say, all right, great, I'm going to go and do on my build phase. I'm going to go the equivalent of what was Oceanside in Texas. I'm going to go and choose Santa Cruz. I'm tainted because I'm California, so I chose local races. Then I'm going to put together my training block. But this time, because I couldn't help but put this in, I'm going to go and do my second day race of the year, end of October. But just 2 weeks before, I'm going to do a 70.3. Now, for many of you guys, that's insane. Why would you do a half Ironman 2 weeks before? But for more experienced athletes, it actually works perfectly. It is your last really hard workout. And then from that, you have a clean out. And then we put a transition week and you go and race. So for the emotionally brave that can go and say their last hard workout that they do is 14 weeks before and it happens to take 4, 5, 6, 7 hours, it's great, and it's your last above Ironman specific hard workout. You clean out the week following, you do a transition week or a race prep week into an A race. Bada bing, typically the second race is always better than the first, which of course is our key race. So that's where I got to. That's hopefully the peek behind the curtain of what we're thinking. All of this stuff that I present tonight is going to come to you in a body of materials. So you're going to have time to look at it. You're going to have time to review, to ask questions. We're going to do meetings with Matt sessions to try and help you. And our coaches are really getting our hands around our common language collectively as a team to make sure that we can bring it to you in a really helpful and clear fashion. What we're hoping for ultimately is creates clarity, familiarity, and predictability, both in terms of performance, but also the training and in you understanding where you're going for. As I said at the start, just one last thing: don't over panic if you're like, wow, I'm not sure, because this is more just, hey, this is an introduction. We're going to give you all the materials. We're going to outline this for you. So it's still rooted in exactly the same methodology. We're just evolving and applying it to try and help you. And it's one of the big things that we really try and do: keep evolving and keep improving. Otherwise, well, evolve or die, eh? Thanks, guys. Take care.